Today's material argues that S/4HANA migrations represent this what once-in-a-decade opportunity to redesign tax architecture by abandoning legacy ERP customizations for a decoupled real-time compliance model.
Yeah, and it successfully frames the urgency of that migration, but I think we can significantly elevate its impact by really pivoting the focus toward execution, risk mitigation, and technological rigor.
The material makes a compelling case for why an organization must adopt a decoupled tax architecture, but it basically stops short of explaining how to initiate that shift.
Right. It's missing the mechanics. I mean, the theoretical foundation is absolutely there, but the C-suite doesn't just need a vision. They need a roadmap.
Exactly. Our target audience here consists of CFOs and CIOs, and these are sophisticated leaders who already live with the pain of legacy systems.
Oh, completely. They know embedding hard-coded tax logic directly into the ERP is just a total nightmare for global compliance.
Right. They already understand they need to externalize that logic. So the weakness here is that the piece lacks the actual transitional steps required to get there. It diagnoses the disease perfectly, but only names the cure without providing the prescription.
And leaving the reader on that shoreline of theory is just a massive missed opportunity. If we want this to be an authoritative guide, it has to bridge the gap between high-level strategy and boots-on-the-ground execution.
So how do we bridge that gap for them? I mean, it's like telling a homeowner they need a modern, earthquake-proof foundation. That is great advice, but without providing the blueprints, they won't know where to actually pour the concrete.
I love that analogy. The suggestion I'd make is to map out a highly practical, phased transition plan. Give them a decision matrix.
Okay, what does that look like in practice? Give me a concrete example.
Well, a highly effective approach would be to include a section detailing, say, day 1 versus year 3 of a decoupled architecture transition. Paint a vivid picture of day 1.
So day 1 isn't necessarily just buying a massive external tax engine and plugging it in.
No, exactly. Maybe day 1 is strictly about standardizing data models within the existing legacy ECC system, before the S4 migration even kicks off.
Oh, right, because a decoupled tax engine is utterly useless if the data you feed it is garbage.
Precisely. It's about ensuring customer and vendor master data is completely clean.
So day 1 is essentially site preparation. And then you contrast that with year 3, showing the fully realized vision.
Yeah. Year 3 is where you show the enterprise having fully integrated a centralized compliance orchestrator, managing real-time API calls across 50 global jurisdictions simultaneously, and all without touching the core S4 code.
Visually laying out that timeline takes so much pressure off the CIO. It proves this doesn't all have to happen overnight in one terrifying Big Bang deployment.
Exactly. And another concrete example for the author, if we're mapping out this transition, we have to talk about the integration layer. The text assumes a connection between S4 and the external orchestrator, but it doesn't really define the pattern.
Yeah, a CIO is going to immediately ask about middleware.
Right. So the piece needs a brief evaluation of, say, 2 or 3 common middleware integration patterns used to connect S4HANA with these external tax engines.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that, because the difference is massive for transactional flow. Like contrasting an event-driven architecture using Apache Kafka with a traditional API gateway.
Yes, exactly. With an API gateway, you're generally looking at point-to-point, synchronous connections, right?
Right, so S4 pings the external tax engine with an invoice, holds the process open, waits for a response, and then moves on, which is just a massive bottleneck.
But if you use an event streaming platform like Kafka, S4 just publishes an event like the creation of a sales order and instantly moves on.
And then the tax engine subscribes to that event stream, processes the compliance logic, and updates the record asynchronously. That is a brilliant distinction to include in the text.
It gives the reader immediate, actionable parameters to hand over to their enterprise architects. And you also need to outline specific criteria a CIO should use when deciding which data layers to centralize first.
Because you can't just externalize everything at once.
Exactly. Do you base it on regulatory urgency, data volume, legacy system complexity?
Like starting with transactional VAT data in a high-risk jurisdiction like Brazil, rather than just basic customer master data in the US.
Right. Giving the reader a tangible framework to make that decision transforms the text from a theoretical white paper into a pragmatic deployment guide.
Moving naturally from the need for those architectural blueprints, any robust blueprint must also account for structural vulnerabilities, which leads to our next area of focus.
Yeah, we have to address the downsides.
A critical gap in the argument is the complete absence of potential risks or operational trade-offs associated with externalizing tax logic from the core ERP.
It really is. The material right now presents the decoupled architecture as this flawless silver bullet. It promises flexibility, scalability, global consistency.
But a deeply technical enterprise listener knows that moving tax logic outside the ERP inherently introduces complex new challenges.
Exactly. You're suddenly dealing with external API dependency risks, severe network latency during end-of-month processing, and the very real threat of vendor lock-in.
And ignoring those realities completely undermines the author's credibility with a sophisticated audience. I mean, let's just aggressively push back on this architecture from the perspective of latency.
Let's do it.
Because there is a glaring paradox in the source material right now. S/4HANA is prized across the entire industry for its in-memory analytics and lightning-fast processing. The whole point is to eliminate bottlenecks.
Right.
So if we are telling the CIO to take millions of real-time transactions and route that data out to an external tax platform over the open internet to be validated, doesn't that introduce the exact operational drag the system was designed to eliminate?
It absolutely does. You are essentially putting a massive speed bump in the middle of a superhighway. And if the author doesn't preemptively address that, the reader will assume they just don't understand enterprise IT mechanics.
So the suggestion here is to introduce a dedicated section that actively acknowledges these architectural hurdles and offers concrete mitigation strategies.
Exactly. You build trust by exposing the flaws in your own proposed model and showing the reader exactly how to manage them.
So what are some concrete examples of those mitigation strategies? What happens when the system breaks?
Well, first, you have to discuss how to establish fallback logic. That is non-negotiable. What happens if the API connection to the external tax engine goes down during a critical real-time transaction?
Oh, picture a global manufacturer. They're trying to ship a massive, time-sensitive order out of a distribution center, and the external tax validator just times out.
Does the S4 system panic and halt the entire supply chain because it can't calculate the VAT?
In a poorly designed system, yes. The truck stays at the loading dock.
Which is catastrophic. So the author needs to detail the alternative. Explain how the system can be configured to process the transaction using a locally cached, estimated tax code, just to keep the supply chain moving.
And then the system flags that specific transaction for an automated reconciliation true-up the moment the connection is restored.
Precisely. Walking the reader through that specific fallback scenario provides immense value, because it shows you understand operational continuity.
And what about addressing my point on latency? How does the CIO manage the overall latency budget across a massive global enterprise to avoid that speed bump?
The author should explicitly dedicate a paragraph to exactly that, calculating and protecting the latency budget. You do this by ruthlessly categorizing your data streams.
What does that categorization look like?
For instance, if a country has mandatory real-time e-invoicing validations, like clearance models, where the government must approve the invoice before the goods ship, those require synchronous blocking calls.
Right. The transaction literally has to wait for the tax engine. You spend your latency budget there because the law demands it.
Exactly. But standard end-of-month compliance data or internal intercompany transactions, those can be streamed asynchronously. Detailing these distinct mechanisms proves that the author's architecture is battle-tested.
Now, grounding the architectural trade-offs in operational reality is vital. But that same rigor completely vanishes when we look at the end of the piece.
Oh yeah, the shift there is wild.
The brief introduction of the Internet of Agents and AI feels totally disconnected from the immediate, practical realities of an S/4HANA migration.
It's an incredibly jarring pivot. The argument jumps suddenly from standardizing data models directly into a future state where intelligent agents autonomously validate transactions.
The weakness here is that it reads like a mandatory nod to current AI trends rather than a logical integrated extension of the core thesis about tax compliance architecture.
Right, the reader has just been wading through the complex, muddy realities of API latency and legacy customizations. Then, boom, they are thrust into a futuristic ecosystem of autonomous agents.
It feels like skipping from basic algebra straight to quantum physics. I mean, if I'm a CFO dealing with decades of messy, fragmented SAP code, reading about an internet of agents feels like science fiction.
It risks alienating the reader at the final hurdle. It makes them question the practicality of everything they just read.
Without grounding, it distracts heavily from the highly practical advice directed at those CIOs and CFOs. Is there a risk that focusing on these autonomous agents causes the reader to just overlook the foundational necessity of getting their data clean at the source?
Absolutely. So, the suggestion is that the author must make a definitive choice here. Either seamlessly integrate the concept of AI as a specific, functional layer within the proposed architecture, or just remove it entirely to maintain a tight focus on ERP and data structuring.
Let's assume the author strongly believes AI is the inevitable future and insists on keeping it. How do they functionally integrate it so it doesn't feel like a tack on buzzword?
You do it by writing a highly specific, highly technical use case. Show the AI actually doing the work.
Okay, give me a concrete example of that.
The author could explain specifically how a localized AI agent might autonomously reconcile a cross-border VAT anomaly in real time within that centralized validation layer we talked about earlier.
So instead of just broadly stating that agents validate transactions, you paint a specific operational scenario. What does that scenario look like under the hood?
Explain how a machine learning model, trained on historical enterprise transactions, monitors the data stream from S4. The agent instantly flags a mismatch between a vendor's registered VAT ID and the jurisdiction of the shipped goods.
Okay, but it doesn't just flag it, right?
No, the agent automatically queries external tax authority databases, determines the correct tax code, and suggests the correction before the S4 system finalizes the invoice.
That shows exactly where the AI sits in the tech stack and what data is manipulating. But from the perspective of the human workflow, how does that integrate? Because an enterprise isn't going to just let an AI unilaterally alter tax codes on multi-million-dollar invoices without oversight.
And that is the perfect segue into defining what external orchestration really looks like when AI gets involved. We need to define the human-in-the-loop mechanics.
Right. If the AI agent detects a highly complex error, one that falls below its confidence threshold for autocorrection, what actually happens? Does it halt the entire S4 transaction batch?
Which would ruin the latency budget, exactly. So the text needs to explain that it intelligently routes the anomalous transaction to a specialized tax analyst's dashboard.
It pulls that single problematic invoice out of the stream.
Exactly. While allowing the rest of the compliant batch to process without delay. Pinning down the exact operational mechanics of the AI transforms this section from a speculative trend into a highly advanced, credible architectural forecast.
This has been a deeply constructive and highly technical critique. Let's just quickly recap the main points. The material has an incredibly powerful premise that an S4 migration is a fleeting chance to fix broken tax systems.
But to persuade an audience of enterprise leaders, it needs to move decisively beyond theory and into execution.
Right. It must openly address the latency and API risks inherent to a decoupled system, and it has to meticulously ground the high-level AI concepts to maintain credibility.
So just to summarize the actionable steps for the listener. First, implement that phased transition roadmap. Show what day 1 versus year 3 looks like, complete with an evaluation of event-driven versus synchronous middleware.
Second, add specific mitigation strategies for API downtime, detailing fallback logic, and how to categorize data to protect the ERP's latency budget.
And third, if you retain the AI section, write a concrete use case showing exactly how an autonomous agent identifies and routes a VAT anomaly without breaking the transaction stream.
We enthusiastically invite you to revise your material based on these architectural deep dives and submit it back to the critique for another round of analysis.
It really is a phenomenal piece of thought leadership.
It just needs the operational blueprints finalized to match the strength of its vision.
Upgrading an enterprise ERP really is treated a lot like swapping a car engine. But if you take the time to draft the meticulous blueprints, account for the friction of the new parts, and keep your focus firmly on the mechanics rather than a science fiction future, you ensure that when you finally turn the key, the machine doesn't just sputter on legacy code, it roars.